Have you ever stood in thick fog and felt something watching you, even though you were alone? In tonight's psychological horror story, Through the Fog, She Watches, we descend into a Scottish coastal town where memory becomes a haunting and the mist hides something that remembers you. Even when you forget it, if you love original #horror story experiences that blend atmosphere with slow burn dread, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. I don't remember the train ride. Not really. There are flickers, yes, the hiss of brakes, the blurred trees racing past the window, the color of wet bark. But most of that final journey is buried beneath a woolen silence. The kind that settles in after too much grief, or too much time alone. All I know is that I arrived in Kilgarren sometime after dusk. The fog met me like an old friend, clinging to my coat, curling through the alleys, swallowing the weak glow of the gas lamps. It never leaves, they say. The villagers call it the breath of the sea. It creeps in through every crack, even when you think the windows are shut tight. The cottage was exactly as described, small, weather-beaten, and half swallowed by ivy. A crooked thing perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a shore that wasn't so much a beach as a graveyard of jagged black stones. The sea wasn't visible that first night, but I could hear it, low and constant, like breathing, like something waiting. I lit a fire with difficulty. The chimney hadn't been swept in what felt like years. The furniture smelled of damp wool and old secrets, but I was grateful for the quiet, for the isolation, for the promise of time spent alone with my paints and nothing else. That was the deal. After all, a year. No visitors, no press, no gallery calls. Just me, my canvases, and the fog. A retreat, the agent had called it. An artist's sabbatical, but it wasn't a retreat. It was a burial, a self-imposed exile for a man who didn't know how to grieve in public. It was on the third morning that I found the painting. I hadn't started yet. My brushes were still sealed in their rolls. The canvases stacked neatly by the easel I'd placed near the north window. I was planning to sketch the shoreline first. There was something haunting about those rocks, like the ribs of a great beast. But there it was, sitting on the easel. A painting, finished. The colors were wet, the brush strokes unmistakably mine. I stared at it for what must have been 20 minutes, heart like a drum in my chest. She stood beneath a crooked lamppost, her figure cloaked in sea gray robes. A veil, thin, almost translucent, covered her face. Behind her, fog spiraled in gentle swirls, darker than it should have been. The light didn't illuminate her so much as frame her, like she was emerging, or preparing to vanish. I didn't know her, but something in the curve of her posture, in the set of her shoulders, in the tilt of her head, felt familiar. Had I dreamt her? No, I wasn't dreaming. I barely slept in those first few days. Too many thoughts. Too many memories of her. Of Elena. I blamed the painting on some sleep-deprived haze. Maybe I'd painted it the night before in a fugue. It wouldn't be the first time an artist worked without remembering. They call it flow. I'd always hated that word. Flow. As if it were gentle, what I'd experienced felt more like being emptied. Still, I didn't throw it away. I set it aside, propped it against the hearth, stared at it over tea. That evening, I went for a walk along the shoreline. The fog was heavier than before, thicker, It didn't just obscure vision, it muffled everything. The crash of the sea, the crunch of gravel, even my own breath, it all seemed distant. Like I was watching myself from behind a veil. I walked until I saw the lamp. It was crooked, standing alone by the pier, half consumed by moss and rust, just like in the painting. And for one impossible moment, I thought I saw her, standing there, veil and all. But when I blinked, there was nothing, only the shape of fog. The next morning, there were two paintings, both of the veiled woman, different poses, different backdrops, same veil, same presence, same unease crawling down my spine. This time, I knew I hadn't painted them. I locked the door to the studio that night, triple-checked the bolts, laid my brushes in a drawer, and tied it shut with twine. The next day, the drawer was open, the brushes wet, and there were 4 paintings. I tried to burn one. The flames caught quickly enough. The canvas curled, blackened, then collapsed into a heap of char. That evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed the mirror in the hallway had fogged over. I hadn't cooked anything hot. There was no steam. The air was cold, but there it was, moisture, as if someone had breathed on the glass from inside. I wiped it away. And behind me, in the reflection, a veiled figure stood just beyond the door. I spun. Nothing. When I turned back, the mirror was dry. The villagers avoid me now. They weren't particularly warm to begin with. Kilgarren's not the sort of place that welcomes outsiders with open arms. But the grocer stopped meeting my eyes. The postmaster no longer knocks, just leaves the parcels on the step. Only one speaks to me regularly. A girl, maybe 8, wears a yellow coat and always carries a string of small wooden dolls. She said her name is Moira. Last week, while I sat sketching by the sea, she approached and sat beside me. Didn't speak at first, just watched me draw. Then, she said, "You shouldn't paint her face. She gets angry if you try." I hadn't told anyone about the paintings. I asked her what she meant. Moira tilted her head, like listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she whispered, "She watches from where the sea forgets." That night, I dreamed of Elena. She was standing in the fog, arms outstretched, eyes wide with terror. Something was dragging her backwards, something I couldn't see, only the trail left in the sand, like fingers clawing at her ankles. She screamed, not my name, but something else. A word I didn't understand. A name. I woke up with pain on my hands. Black. Wet. Smelling faintly of salt. There was a new painting on the wall. This time, she wasn't veiled. Her face had no features, just a swirl of fog, dark at the center, like an eye. Watching. Always watching. There were 11 by the end of the week. All of them of her. Always veiled. Never in the same position twice. One with her head turned slightly to the right, fingers raised as if beckoning. Another, sitting in an old iron bathtub in a room I didn't recognize. One showed her standing behind my cottage, shrouded in fog, one hand pressed flat against the window. They weren't just paintings, they were memories, but not mine. I tried cataloging them, like a scientist dissecting his own madness. Measured the brush strokes, compared palette choices, even looked at the drying times. But the more I tried to analyze the work, The more it resisted interpretation, the fog outside grew thicker with each passing day. It pressed against the windows now, as if it were looking in, and the veiled woman, she began appearing in places I hadn't painted. Reflections in darkened windows, knots in the wood grain of the floor, once on the surface of my tea. Before the ripple swallowed her face, I stopped drinking tea after that. Moira came by again, out of nowhere, on a morning when the sky was the color of wet slate. She stood outside the gate, not coming closer, her yellow coat the only color in sight. I saw her, she said. I didn't ask who. She's in your eyes now. I didn't respond, just stared, waiting. Moira held up one of her carved dolls. This one's you, she said, and dropped it into a shallow puddle. It sank instantly, but the puddle was no more than 2 inches deep. When I looked back up, she was gone. I stopped locking the studio. There was no point. Every morning brought new paintings. Some were unfinished, others painfully complete. I began leaving them outside, hoping the sea air might destroy them. They didn't rot, didn't peel, didn't even fade. They multiplied. On the 4th night of the 2nd week, I dreamt of a woman walking backwards through the fog, dragging a silver chain. The links made no sound. Her veil fluttered without wind. Behind her, the landscape kept changing. First cliffs, then empty streets, then a room that looked exactly like mine. She stopped in front of a mirror, and I realized the person she was watching was me, asleep. I began seeing others, men mostly, older, weathered. Locals. They'd be standing in the fog on the far side of the village, staring toward the sea, not speaking, just watching, like sentinels carved from mist and salt. When I'd try to approach, they'd vanish into the whiteness without a sound. I asked the butcher about it once. He just shook his head and mumbled, "Not ours anymore. Not since she came back." I didn't ask who she was. I already knew. One painting, found halfway up the attic stairs, nearly stopped my heart. It showed the inside of my studio, my easel, my brushes, and me. But the figure wasn't painting. He was staring at the canvas with a horrified expression, hands raised, mouth open in a silent scream. I didn't remember posing like that. But when I stood in front of the canvas with the painting in hand, it aligned perfectly. The composition, the angle, even the grain of the wood behind me. It wasn't a painting of the studio. It was a painting of right now. I didn't leave the house for days after that. Let the food rot. Let the fire die out. I spoke to the woman in the paintings, asked her name, asked what she wanted, begged her to stop. She never answered, but her posture began to change, more assertive, more present. One canvas showed her standing with both hands pressed to the veil, as if trying to pull it away. Another, closer, so close the entire canvas was just the suggestion of a face behind mist, like she was pressing up against the very fabric of the paint. It didn't feel like I was capturing her. It felt like she was reaching through. I found a trapdoor in the floor beneath the studio's rug, old, rusted, covered in salt deposits. I don't remember opening it. But when I came to, because I'd lost nearly 3 hours, there was a small black canvas lying beside me. Unframed. It showed the veiled woman at the base of a spiral staircase, descending into fog, and beneath her feet were bones, not animal, not quite human either, longer, sharper. I don't know how to explain this, but I heard the painting, not in my mind, not metaphorically, audibly. A low hum, not a note, not music, just a vibration, like a growl slowed down 1,000 times, like stone remembering it used to be alive. That night, the fog seeped through the chimney. I swear it did. The fire was out, but the room grew colder. And from the mist, I could hear the sound of wet feet on the floorboards. Deliberate, bare, one step, then another. I didn't look. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for the mirror on the mantel, held it at an angle to see what stood behind me. Nothing. And then, slowly, the mirror began to frost over. When I wiped it clean, my reflection wasn't alone. She stood beside me, closer than ever, hand outstretched. She moved when I moved, but her hand moved independently. I dropped the mirror. It didn't shattered. It simply cracked in a spiral, like a whirlpool, like an eye. I woke up on the floor of the studio the next morning, knees aching, knuckles raw. A single word had been carved into the wall with something sharp, maybe a palette knife. Remember, it wasn't my handwriting. It had been nearly a month since I arrived in Kilgarren. At least, I think it had. Time moves differently when the sun never quite rises, when every window shows the same gray blur, and the sound of the sea blots out all thought. Some mornings I'd wake, convinced it was still the same day as yesterday. Other days, I'd find my clock reset, the date reversed on the calendar, and then there were the times I'd look in the mirror and feel older, only slightly, just enough to notice a deepening wrinkle, a gray hair that hadn't been there before, eyes that looked like they'd been awake far too long. I tried to blame it on stress, but the paintings knew better. I found the journal tucked into the false bottom of the kitchen drawer. It was old, hand-stitched, wrapped in cracked leather, the corners flaking like dried leaves. No name, no date. The first entry was written in a tight, spidery script. She came in the fog, first in dreams, then in reflection, then in me. The handwriting was frantic, slanted. Pages were torn out. Others were stained, some with ink, some with something darker, almost rust-colored. Whoever had lived here before me had also been a painter. That much was clear. Dozens of entries described the woman with the veil, always just beyond the canvas, always watching. One passage stood out more than the rest. I tried to paint her face once, just once. The brush broke in my hand. The mirror cracked. My own mouth bled, though I'd spoken no words. She won't be seen. She already sees. There were sketches in the back of the journal, rough, desperate, variations of the same form. Long limbs, draped fabric, a veiled face, and always the swirling spiral where the heart should be, as if something inside her was moving. Turning point, one final note was scribbled across the inside back cover. The fog doesn't come from the sea. The sea comes from the fog, and she comes from what remembers. I didn't sleep that night. The paintings now covered nearly every wall. They'd started appearing in places I hadn't even prepared: canvases, inside drawers, behind the stove, even one tacked to the underside of the bed frame. Some were in oil, others charcoal, some scratched into wood, some gouged with fingernails into plaster. All of her. She no longer stood in the fog. She was the fog. Her figure, once distinct, had begun to blur into the swirling mist, a suggestion of limbs. And I behind gauze, fingertips reaching from the edges of every frame. Sometimes, I swear I heard a whisper when I passed too close to one, like breathing through wet silk, or weeping. Moira returned, briefly. Only once more. She didn't come to the gate this time. I found her sitting on the studio steps, staring out at the sea. She didn't speak, just handed me another doll. This one was different. It wore a miniature veil made of gauze. Its face had no features. "Did you make this?" I asked. She shook her head. "She left it for you." "Who?" But she only looked at me then. Sad, older than she should have been. "She's already inside the brush," she said. "That's how she remembers how to be made." And then she whispered something that chilled me more than any painting had yet. "You're not the first to bring her back, but you might be the first she keeps." The fog grew heavier that evening. I couldn't see the garden gate, could barely make out the door frame. The light from the fireplace felt wrong, like it wasn't pushing back the shadows but inviting them closer. I tried to burn the journal. The pages wouldn't catch. And no matter how many matches I struck, how dry the kindling, how fiercely I held it to the flames, it simply smoldered, smoking faintly, the leather growing warm but never igniting. Eventually, I gave up. Tossed it across the room. It landed open, not to a page I'd seen before. This one was blank, except for one sentence, freshly written in bold, confident strokes. "Open the door." And beneath it, smaller, "She's almost remembered." I didn't open the door that night, but the next morning, the door was gone. Not just ajar, gone. The frame bricked over. Seamless. As if no door had ever existed there. I stood in front of it, hand pressed to the cold stone, trying to understand. And then I heard a voice, not spoken, not from outside, from within. A woman's voice, low and slow, like breath exhaled through layers of fog. "We only wait for you to remember us." That day, I found a self-portrait on the floor. One I never painted. One that showed me, not as I looked, but as I feared. Eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut, and behind me, hands curling from the fog like vines around a tombstone. And in the center of my chest, a spiral, just like hers. Her name was Elena. I haven't said that out loud in years. Even now, saying it, thinking it, feels like tearing open a wound I've kept neatly stitched and painted over with silence. She was the first to ever truly see me. The only one who knew what lived behind the canvas. Not just the brushstrokes, but the rot beneath. She died 3 years ago. Car crash. Black ice. Instant. Everyone told me how lucky I was not to be with her that night. That fate had spared me, but they didn't understand. Fate didn't spare me. It sentenced me. I started painting again the day after her funeral. Nothing of her. I couldn't. I wouldn't. Instead, I painted empty rooms, wilted flowers, weathered furniture, always missing a leg or caving at the center. Light falling through dust like something divine turning away. That's when the fog first appeared in my work. Even back then, before I came to kill Garen. before the veil.it seeped in at the edges, insidious, waiting. Now I wake with the fog inside my lungs. I cough mist, dreaming white. And the worst part, I've started painting Elena again. Only it's not her. It's the veiled woman. But her hands, they're Elena's. Her neck tilted just so. That's Elena's posture when reading. The curve of her jaw, barely visible through the veil, that's the same line I traced with my thumb during her last night alive. I didn't paint those details. I couldn't have. But they're there. She's there. Or maybe she never left. I found a photo in a shoebox beneath the floorboards, one I didn't bring with me. It's from a time I don't remember. A gathering, a bonfire. Half the face is blurred. But in the back, standing alone by the edge of the sea, Elena, only she's not facing the fire. She's facing the fog, her figure slightly faded, like she was already being pulled away. When I flipped the photo over, someone had scrawled 2 words in charcoal. She remembers. Things disappear now. Time. Objects. Whole hours. I write notes to myself on the bathroom mirror, but they vanish by morning. I try to record my voice on tape, frantic whispers about what's happening, but when I play them back, all I hear is waves, not crashing breathing. Even the journal from the drawer is fading, pages blanking out, replacing entries with empty lines, or sometimes with poems. Terrible, simple, childish things like this: a brush, a bone, a breath, a bride. She waits beyond where truths have died. I don't know if I wrote that. I don't think I did, but it feels familiar, like something Elena would hum when sleepwalking. And yes, she used to sleepwalk. One night, I awoke to the sound of dripping. Thick, heavy, not water. Paint. It was oozing from the walls. A dark, glossy black, reeking of linseed and old blood. When I touched it, it was warm. It clung to my skin. And then I heard her voice, Elena's, but distorted, coming from inside the wall. You didn't follow. So I became what would make you see. The fog poured in through the keyhole like breath through pursed lips. I passed out before I could respond. I began to wonder if I had ever truly known Elena, or if the fog was rewriting her, layering her memory with its own version. What if that's what the woman in the veil was? A collage of forgotten faces. A mosaic of grief so deep it became sentient. She wasn't haunting me. She was becoming me. Or worse, I was becoming her. I no longer trust my hands. They paint without permission. I black out. Wake to new canvases, each one closer to real. Point one of them. It showed our apartment in Edinburgh, not the way it looked, the way it did that final morning. Coffee half drunk. A scarf draped over the chair she never used. Her shoes by the door, still wet from the snow. And in the window, drawn in fog, come back. Only I never wrote that. I never saw it, but I knew it had been there. Yesterday, I found a note inside one of the veiled woman's paintings. Literally inside, trapped between the layers of paint. I only saw it because the canvas began to peel itself open. The note was written in Elena's handwriting. You have to finish remembering, Alistair. She's made of what we left undone. And beneath that, she wears the veil because she's what grief looks like when we try to dress it up. I cried for the first time in years. There's one painting I've been afraid to look at. It sits in the studio's center, shrouded in black cloth, untouched. I don't remember putting it there, but I know what it is, what it must be. It's her, not the veiled woman, Elena, whole, smiling, alive. Or maybe it's what's left of her, now that the fog has fed long enough. The spiral on her chest, the veil lifting, the fog behind her no longer mist, but faces, mine among them. I stopped trying to leave days ago. The road is gone. The gate rusted into the earth. Every path turns back to the studio, no matter how far I walk. Even the sea, once roaring with tide and foam, now lies still, flat as slate. And the fog, it's not weather anymore, it's architecture. It builds things now. Walls where none stood. Windows that look into other rooms, sometimes other memories. Doors that should not exist. And one in particular, a tall, blackened archway with no handle. No hinges. It simply stands in the hallway where my bedroom used to be. A door that was never built. And yet, it waits. Every time I walk by it, something calls, not with sound, but with recognition, like a dream I forgot having. Or a promise I never meant to keep. I prepared myself to open it, not with keys, but with paintings that I lined the hallway with. Every portrait I'd done since coming here. Each one showed her, Elena, the veiled woman, or something between. If I was constructing a gallery of my own undoing. I painted until my fingers cracked, until my eyes blurred, until my own reflection stopped following my movements. And only then did the door open. On its own, silently, revealing nothing, only fog and the scent of turpentine and salt. I stepped through, and the world bent sideways. No walls, no ceiling, just an endless gray, like standing inside a thought halfway forgotten. Shapes moved at the edge of vision, some tall, some bent, none truly formed, and at the center, suspended like a painting floating in liquid light, her, but not as I had seen her, not veiled, not hidden. This time, she faced me, eyes like dried petals, mouth like a torn seam, and she spoke. You remember me because you could not keep her. You painted me to unpaint your guilt. The fog curled around her words, thickening as they sank into me. I am what grief builds when it is left to rot. I am the woman beneath the veil beneath the woman. And now, you remember why. I fell to my knees, because I did remember, not the accident, not Elena's death, but what came before. The argument, the way I let her leave that night, angry, eyes wet, scarf forgotten, the words I never took back, the painting I finished instead of calling her. I had traded love for legacy, and when she died, I buried her in brushstrokes. I made her absence into my art. That's what the veiled woman was, not a ghost, not a watcher, but a reminder. A monument built from unresolved memory. A prison, and I was the warden, and the prisoner, and the architect. She approached point one step, then another, fog dripping from her fingertips like candle wax. You brought me here with every canvas. You gave me face with every forgotten detail, and now I will return the favor. She lifted a single finger and placed it over my chest, over my heart, where I felt movement, not a beat. A spiral, turning inward and then outward, And then everything unraveled. I saw every painting I had ever made in reverse, strokes pulling back into the brush, color unmixing, images unbecoming. I saw Elena's smile, and then her frown, and then her turning away. I saw the night she left. I saw myself, not stopping her. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the fog. I was in the studio, alone. Or so I thought, until I turned and saw the final canvas, still wet, still breathing, and on it, not the veiled woman, not Elena, but me, staring back. Only now, I wore the veil. I've stopped using mirrors, not out of fear, out of certainty. I know what I'd see now. A man with a paint-stained face, eyes hollowed by fog. A veil, thin, transparent, drawn across his soul. She isn't watching through the mist anymore. She's watching through me. I haven't left the studio in days. Or maybe weeks. Time no longer unfolds, it curls, turns inward, like a spiral. That's how the fog moves, how memory loops, how grief grows teeth. And the spiral is in everything now, the cracks in the floorboards, the whirls of my fingerprints, the patterns I find in my soup, in my dreams, in the way her voice curls at the edges of silence. It's no longer just a symbol. It's a map. A vortex. A trap. Last night, I dreamed of Elena again, but it wasn't a memory. She stood at the edge of a cliff, wind tearing at her coat, veil in hand. The sea behind her was still, flat as slate, but glowing from beneath, like some ancient eye slowly opening. She didn't speak. She only pointed to the spiral in the sky, and then placed the veil over her own face, the last thing I heard before I woke up. You only see her when you forget who you are. I awoke to find all my paintings gone. Every one. The canvas is blank. The pigments evaporated. Even the brushes had turned to ash, except one. The final painting. The one of me. It had changed again. This time, the spiral was on my forehead, and beneath the image, written in dried paint that smelled faintly of brine and turpentine, let go and become. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. I did what I always do when I'm terrified. I painted, but not from imagination, not from grief. I painted the spiral over and over, on the floor, on the walls, across the windows, onto my own hands. I followed its curve until I could no longer tell whether I was circling inward or being drawn downward. And at the center, a single black door, the same one from before, only now it was inside me. I knew what I had to do. I picked up a blade, not to end things, but to unseal them. I carved the spiral into the center of my chest, not deep, not fatal, just enough to let the memory breathe. And when I did, I saw her, not Elena, not the veiled woman, but me. Or the man I used to be. He stood there, paintbrush in hand, before the first canvas, back before grief, before fog, before the accident, and he whispered, "Finish the painting." So I painted one last time, hands trembling, eyes half dashed blind. No plan, no image, just truth, all of it. The spiral, Elena, the fog, the door, the veil, the choice. And when I was done, the painting breathed. It opened like an eye, and I stepped through. I don't know if I'm alive anymore, not in the usual sense, but I still think that I still remember, and I still watch, from the other side of the fog, from behind the veil, from inside the spiral. And every so often, someone walks the shore of Kilgarren. They see the mist curl unnaturally, hear a brushstroke echo from the rocks, feel the air go still, like the breath of something waiting. And if they look closely into a puddle, a window, a painting they don't remember buying, they'll see me, veiled, watching, just like she did, just like you will, eventually, when the spiral finds you too. So, what do you think she is? Is she a ghost, memory, or something older and more patient? Comment your thoughts below and let us know if you can survive being watched in the fog. If this Scottish horror story gave you the chills, don't forget to subscribe for more paranormal stories.